Hello and welcome. We are here with Ryan Schuiling. He is a local sports reporter, been in the media industry for around 20 years in various capacities. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you coming out.
Deb, I appreciate you having me. Very comfortable surroundings. This might be the most cozy studio I've ever been in.
It helps get people to open up a
Oh
little
yeah,
bit.
well I'm going to open up anyway, so I'm ready for that.
Well, I appreciate you coming out. It seems as if you've been following the Nasser case, which is what we're talking about here today, since day one. I remember maybe sometime last year, someone came up to me and said, "Can you believe Ryan Schuiling's tweets?" And I went to my phone and I said, "What is he tweeting? What is he talking about?" And then I realized this tough, hard story that you're covering. And it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you were the first or one of the first local reporters who's been covering this since it began.
I would say the Indy Star article that came out in September 2016 broke the ice on this, and that's when Rachel Den Hollander, who I've become very familiar with, she and I have exchanged many messages over the last several months, going back about a calendar year, came forward with the allegations against Larry Nasser. It was interesting because that was kind of a parallel track to what Indy Star was originally investigating, which was more along the lines of the abuses that's been alleged for Twist stars John Geddert, more of psychological abuse, some physical, but not sexual. Caroli Ranch, same thing. But Rachel wanted to make sure, hey, if you're investigating abuse, why don't you check out this Larry Nasser thing, because what happened to me wasn't right. At that point, she didn't know if she was the only one, if maybe she was mistaken, had this happened to others. And obviously what we've seen over the last week, it has become something incredible on a national, international scale, the likes of which I didn't expect, anticipate, nor have I ever encountered in my career. This is the biggest story I've ever covered, and I believe it's the biggest story I ever will cover.
When you began covering it, and this is sort of, I'm not downplaying the survivors. They're courageous, bless their hearts for coming forward. It's a very difficult thing to do, sexual assault, domestic violence, rape, all of those. It's very hard for people to come forward and talk about what's happened to them. So bless their hearts for doing that. And the media coverage of it and people talking about it. And I'm gonna show my cell phone here, talking about it through Twitter and Facebook and social media, because that's how I've been following it this whole time. Is it hard because you're a sports reporter? Was it hard to cover this a harder news type story?
It wasn't hard to cover, but it was a hard decision to make, because I think in sports, a lot of times we're patted on the head and we're kind of the joking around guys and highlights. And wasn't that a great game? And, for 2 hours a day, I'll come on and we'll have a lot of fun, Jason, my producer, and I, about talking craft beer, experiential life things. But when this came to my attention, it had a definite sports underlying theme for little girls throughout this area, Meridian Township in particular here, your viewers, but also throughout the greater Lansing area, anybody that had any affiliation or connection to Twist stars, which of course Larry Nasser had a connection to, and he was on the ballot for the school board in Holt. So this was very local, and it was very sports related. So my decision at first to cover it came at a price. I had to risk access to Michigan State University that I normally would enjoy, whether that's interviews with Mark D'Antonio, Tom Izzo, attending games with a press credential. Those were all going to be at stake, and I knew it, that if I provided honest, objective, hard-hitting coverage of a story like this that was so impactful, that was so explosive, that could have residual effects. And, have I garnered some heat, taken some bullets? Yeah, I would say that I have. But every time I'm in that courtroom, every time I talk to one of the survivors, every time I talk to a mother of one of the girls or a father of one of the girls, it's all worth it to me. I wouldn't change a thing. If I had to do over again, I would do it. And as a matter of fact, I would have started covering this even sooner had I known what this would become.
Were you denied access ever, or do you feel like you were treated differently at all? Because it is a fear as a reporter. It's a fear that, geez, if I go too far, maybe they won't want me to interview them any longer. That is true. That is something that reporters
and that's all up to them, and that's how I view this. That's on them. My relationships are what they are. I've never pretended to be anything else to anyone else than who I am, and Deb, you know me to a certain degree. I like to believe I'm very forthright and straightforward. If that's not good enough, I don't play the glad-handing game. I don't do that. I don't politicize behind the scenes, shake hands. That's not my motive in all of this. I don't want it to be perceived as my motive. The only motive I've had throughout this whole thing is to uncover truth, wherever that leads me. And if that leads me to an uncomfortable, dark place, which it has many times, that needs to be talked about. And if there are people accountable within the walls at Michigan State University, that needs to be talked about. And when the Board of Trustees start turning on one another, like we've seen at this point, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I didn't cause that. But I will say the coverage of what we've done, if I can give one example. 20 years ago, you mentioned my experience in the business. Joel Ferguson could come on a Tim Stout radio program in the morning and they could shoot the breeze and he might make a few missteps and it would be forgotten within a day. The business cycle, the news cycle would forget it and nobody would think the wiser. Joel Ferguson went on that radio program. It was brought to my attention. I listened to it. I was horrified. I tweeted it out. It caught fire on Twitter and social media. It got written about as an article in the Detroit Free Press. Joel Ferguson had to back away from those comments. It caused Diane Byram, I believe, to come forward and call for the resignation of President Simon and admonish Joel Ferguson. All of that happened in 2018. There's not a chance that happens in 1998. I think that is the difference of what you're talking about with the phone and following everything online.
The influence of social media.
In a good way, in a very good way, to uncover truth and for people out there to be far better informed. This wall, this ivory tower that perhaps the Board of Trustees once enjoyed, that's gone. Those days are gone. I'm glad they're gone. And I think for us and the general public, the residents of East Lansing, this entire area, to have that kind of access to knowledge, to facts, to reporting, it is critical, I think, from this point forward, that reporters stay on the cutting edge. They were credited in court by Angela Povolitis, the prosecutor. Had that story never been written in Indy Star, had Rachel Den Hollander not come forward and addressed them, this story might not have ever been told by anyone. And think about Jordan Weber. All of the athletes, all of the gymnasts, 150 up to 180, all of them would remain silent. That is chilling to me.
So I'm assuming I'm not the only one who has watched most of this story unfold through social media. The testimonies. Every day I watched it through social media.
Right.
20 years ago, like you said, we wouldn't have had live Facebook, live Twitter. We wouldn't have been watching the testimonies in the way, we wouldn't have heard those stories like we did. We reached out to WLNS, asked them if we could rebroadcast the testimonies, play them back. They're graciously willing to work with us on that because those stories should be retold and not forgotten. What was it like walk us through the courtroom as a reporter and Judge Aquilina, she had made the statement that the media was great to work with, and what was that experience like from the reporter perspective?
I think that's an evolution too. I think in years past you might have seen a more adversarial relationship between the courts, the lawyers, and the media going back and forth. And I think what was recognized early on that this was going to be a synergistic relationship. In other words, I was working in collaboration, whether it was Ali Illich at Channel 6 or Matt Mancarini, Lansing State Journal, all the great reporting that he's done. We had Dan Murphy was there, ESPN, all of us kind of comparing notes. Katie Strang from The Athletic. And then I got to give credit as well to Angela Povolitis, who welcomed the media coverage. The women and the families needed the media coverage to expose exactly what was going on. And for Judge Aquilina, I'll say this, I believe that it is a landmark case. It garnered national attention. It is a transformative event in the sense that the images, the pictures, the faces, the names, the identities, the stories of each of these women were valuable. They were told, and they changed minds. If you think about Brian Breslin on Saturday issuing a rebuke of Mitch Lyons, who had called for the resignation of President Simon, and Brian Breslin states, nope, all the rest of us trustees were uniformly supporting President Simon. Mitch is off on his own island. How much changed in 5 days? 5 days to where President Simon announces her resignation. Brian Breslin not only accepts it, but then says, again, just 5 days later, I agree, it's time to move on. What changed in 5 days? I'll tell you what changed. All of those women were seen and heard for the first time ever, and that's important.
Yeah, you had sent out a couple of retweets, some Throwback Thursday
Right.
tweets. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, again, the power of social media, the
Yeah.
power of archiving video online, which you guys do here through Facebook Live, everything you do, sharing resources with Channel 6. A friend of mine now, Ross Jones, over at WXYZ and Channel 7. I did a Sunday show with him. It was nearly a year ago last March where he sat down with Joel Ferguson and asked him exactly, how Michigan State was going to look coming out of all of this. And at that time, Michigan State University was conducting its own internal investigation. And Joel Ferguson said at that time, MSU is going to look great. And MSU wants to get to the bottom of this. Well, MSU obviously doesn't look great right now, not at all. And they're not getting to the bottom of it because news breaking just a day before you and I started talking about the Title IX investigation, documents that were not turned over. So it really truly looks, at least at this point, from a reporter's standpoint, they were not trying to get to the bottom of it. They didn't want to know. They didn't want the federal government to know coming in for the Title IX investigation. There might be more to uncover now. The more that you conceal, the more that it remains to be seen whether or not you have something to hide. And that is the problem Michigan State faces right now. They have lived in a code of silence. The mafia called it omerta for so long. You don't talk outside of school. You don't share details. That type of philosophy and thinking has led, I believe, to the demise of President Simon, and there will be others. I will predict that.
What's happening today? Where do you see this going? And, I appreciate your time coming out here because I know there's breaking news. It
There
seems
is.
like every minute,
Well, where is it going? I would say the civil litigation continues. I've been in conversations with Jamie White from White Law in Okemos, who represents a large number of the survivors in a pending lawsuit against Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics. There's the Attorney General's office, Bill Schuiling, who will be investigating from a criminal standpoint what did not happen in the internal investigation for Michigan State. I messaged Angela Povolitis today about whether or not she would personally be assigned to that case. She offered me a no comment. I take that to mean that perhaps if she were to be involved, this is me now expressing my opinion, she has better knowledge of this case than anybody from that standpoint in terms of the ability to dig into the details that need to be discovered. The person I'm keeping an eye on in a lot of this, though, is a Detective Lieutenant Andrea Munford, who is a champion and a hero to a lot of these women in the Michigan State University Police Department. Now, that might sound out of hand to be a conflict of interest. It's MSU's own campus police. But she has done more to elicit statements, to welcome them in of these victims than anybody. And she was the link, the linchpin, if you will, between these victims and Angela Povolitis. What her role is in this going forward in terms of providing information in the investigation, that's kind of the next step of this. But Michigan State, at this point, even separate from those two tracks, cannot get out of their own way. The NCAA is investigating, ESPN, Deadspin reporting, the things that we're talking about with Title IX. I mean, people in the civil litigation phase right now, like a Jamie White, are just sitting back and watching Michigan State self-destruct. So we'll see what happens these next couple days, maybe even weeks, but there are a lot of names that a lot of people know out there that I think are going to be held accountable sooner rather than later.
Who leads Michigan State during this time period? Who's leading all of this now with Louisiana K. Simon stepping down?
It's a great question, and I think it's part of the reason why they are where they are. Nobody at this point. I mean, the Board of Trustees meets on Friday. There is division within the ranks there. You have a faction of Brian Masalem and Diane Byram, as well as Mitch Lyons, 3. Then you have the rest of the board, the 5. And that's the old guard. I'm referring them on my program, a little bit jokingly, not so much, as the Breslin Bunch. They are steadfast, stuck in the mud, unwilling to change, day late and a dollar short, reactive, not proactive. So as they sort out their differences, they're going to have to determine who's an interim president. I've heard rumors for everybody out there, 3 former governors, Jennifer Granholm, James Blanchard, John Engler. I've even heard the wild card idea of Judge Rosemary Aquilina herself becoming interim president of Michigan State. I don't know how realistic that is, but that certainly would be a headline grabber. And politically, from a public relations standpoint, that would be a game changer for Michigan State, because that would be welcoming in the very judge who sat before all these victims. And she's a Michigan State graduate, 1979. I think it'd be a brilliant play. I don't know that Michigan State has the gumption to do it, and on the other side, if Judge Aquilina would be willing to do it. But that's the next thing to look for from them.
What would what would be the focus at the Rock? I understand the original focus Friday following the hearing was to, show protest against Luanna K. Simon and trying to get her to step down. Well, what's their focus now? Do you know, and will you be there?
I think I'll be there from a journalistic standpoint. I hope it still happens because real change is affected on a college, university campus from the student body that's there on the ground, that's paying the tuition dollars. And Deb, I think it's our parents' generation, the Vietnam generation, protests, make love not war, getting together, racial injustice, women's rights, all these movements that came out of the 1960s and 70s. You see a disaffected college student body now that's not unifying anything. This is unifying.
Yeah.
They're talking about wearing teal in the zone throughout the game on Friday against Wisconsin. If they represent that also in the gathering at the Rock 6 p.m. Friday, it doesn't have to be protesting necessarily against something now that President Simon has resigned, but to be in solidarity, to support these victims, many of whom were Michigan State University student athletes. I think it could be a very positive show of support. I think it could affect change, at least in perceptions. It can garner attention from a board of trustees that all too often throughout this entire process has appeared tone deaf, out of touch, out of step with the types of people I'm interacting with on Twitter, that I'm talking to directly, having firsthand conversations with, listeners of my program. You take the temperature of that room, it's a very different world, I believe, from what the Board of Trustees thinks they have.
I almost wish when I read statements from administrators or board of trustees, or when they make statements that are in regards to tough cases where people have been violated, I wonder if they've ever sought the advice before they made the statement of people who were actually victims of sexual assault or abuse. Because when I read statements given by them, sometimes I think they've never been a victim. They didn't ask someone, would this offend you? And I think that's some of the offense that seen on social media that has been taken and retweeted, over and over again, is the words that they use, or the lack of words that they use.
And Deb, I think following up on that point, what it goes to for me is priorities. What do you prioritize? When Larissa Boyce asks President Simon, please, will you attend my statement today that I'm going to make on the record? And the response she gets is, I don't think I'll be able to have time in my schedule to fit that in. What else is on your schedule that's more important than this? Nothing. Yeah. And when you're in a Board of Trustees meeting,
to hear that.
It was gut-wrenching for a student who suffered on Michigan State's campus. No matter what you feel about the details, I'll leave those there for now. But the Board of Trustees meeting in December was problematic too. You had victims and their families speaking to the board. You had protesters present who were carrying signs in that room. And what does the board focus on? We're going to give Luanna K. Simon a raise.
Yeah.
How do you process what you're witnessing in front of your very eyes and come to the conclusion that the priority should be giving our president, who's embattled right now, a raise? You're doubling down on a bad hand, to borrow an analogy from blackjack tables. But every step of the way, it seems, they haven't been able to prioritize things correctly. Even if she was going to take all the heat in the world and get peppered like she did the half day that she showed up, Luanna K. Simon, she should have been at every day, greeted every woman. Deb, I have met and talked to so many of these women. I know their names. I know their faces. They know mine. They've been on my show or they've not been on my show. I've talked to their families. That shouldn't have been me doing that as a radio host. That should have been Luanna K. Simon doing that as president of Michigan State University, demonstrating leadership.
Do you think she's taken too much heat? Do you think too much pressure has been put on her because she's at the top of Michigan State, or do you think everybody's looking at the top and saying, you know what, you're the lead person, this happened under your watch?
Yeah.
I mean, I have a small department. I have six, 7 people under me and some interns. So if something goes wrong, it's pretty easy to go, Deb, kind of thing. There's a gigantic university full of people. So, there's some people out there that think that she's the scapegoat or taking too much heat, and maybe she didn't know anything.
Here's what I'll say. I think there's 2 ways to kind of come at that, and one of which might surprise people to hear from me. I will defend Luanna K. Simon. The saying is, a fish rots from its head down. And from that standpoint, the buck stops here, you're accountable. Double-edged sword of being president of the university. If things go well, you build a Gilbert Pavilion, you have all kinds of construction, new events coming to campus, donors. You get credit for that. But when things go south, if you're willing to take credit for things that you only have cursory involvement with or leadership on, you have to take blame when things go wrong too. But the other part of that is, if Michigan State were to have the false notion or premise that simply removing Luana K. Simon was the end of it and they're done, it's not Luana K. Simon's fault directly that Larry Nasser did what he did. She did not directly enable him, but there were several people in the steps in between, whether it was Kathy Klages, gymnastics coach, Dean William Strample in the Department of the College of Osteopathic Medicine, enablers of Larry Nasser who firsthand were very well aware of the procedures he was doing and either signed off of them or just took his word for it ahead of the word of these girls who were not comfortable with that procedure. A full account from top to bottom is what Trustee Byram has called for. She's right. And that's Bill Schueting's office doing that investigation that Michigan State failed to do. And it's not about criminal wrongdoing from Luana K. Simon's standpoint, but if there are enablers, people who silenced victims, who did not properly execute mandatory reporting, then they absolutely need to be held accountable. And Deb, here's the really stunning fact to me, is out of all of this with the Nasser investigation, the only person to lose their job in terms of being fired by Michigan State because of Larry Nasser was Larry Nasser. Kathy Klages retired while on suspension. Dean Strample stepped down from the dean's role, but he's still on faculty. Brooke Lemon tried to secure and steal documents on behalf of Larry Nasser. She was forced to resign. None of these people were fired outright. No message was sent of accountability from Michigan State, and this is the cross they bear because of that reluctance, because of that decision.
It shocks me because I'm pretty sure I would be fired if I did something like that. I'm pretty sure I'd be gone. Like, there's no way I would be forced to retire or like easily weeded out and go away. Like, it would be like gone. Like, there's no way. It boggles my mind.
And that's the thing. I mean, if you look at this just strictly detached emotionally, left brain, logical, strategical, business only, why would you, if you were Luana K. Simon or Mark Hollis or the Board of Trustees, why would you die on the hill of Kathy Klages? Why would you die on the hill of Dean William Strample? Why would you not be willing to be very brash about it, to throw those two under the bus and at least hold them accountable, give the vision, appearance, optics of holding somebody accountable for what Larry Nasser was able to do? But what do we hear instead? We hear that determined sexual predators are going to find a way to abuse children in the darkness, in the shadows. That was Luana K. Simon's comment. That's false. Larry Nasser did this in broad daylight. Larry Nasser did this in full view. Larry Nasser did this with full knowledge of several people in the department, knowing that he was doing something, but they just kind of trusted him because it was the great Larry Nasser. So when you look at it that way, you know, I don't know how you come away from it saying, like Joel Ferguson did, well, Larry Nasser did this on an island. If Larry Nasser were on an island, zero women would have been abused. And the fact that he had access to Michigan State's facilities, the fact that he had validation of Michigan State University and their brand as a DO, as the gold standard, and USA Gymnastics has every hand in this as well, that validated him, that gave him a license to fondle, and that's what he used to access all of these little girls. It's because of his affiliation with USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University, and their vetting process, whatever it was for his methods, they've now been discounted and discredited. You saw Judge Aquilina say in court, these were phony medical procedures. She wouldn't let him treat her dogs, she said. And the thing I come away with most is none of his treatments right now can be viewed as legitimate. They might be all off the table. He might be a total quack. You had athletes that either had injuries that were not treated. Jordan Weber was one, shin splints, couldn't participate in the all-around, the 2012 games, or they got worse, or they ended careers because the injuries that he should be able to treat, even if you put the sexual abuse aside, perhaps we're thinking now he wasn't even qualified to do those. He had everybody snowed. And from our standpoint, you or me, we don't know necessarily if we're standing in a room, he might be doing something legitimate, he might not be. I expect from a college of osteopathic medicine, trained doctors, to be able to spot a procedure as being perhaps a red flag, question it, have the intellectual curiosity to investigate it further, and then maybe, just maybe, Larry Nassar's not right or proper in doing this method. And the biggest thing of all is, if it made a young girl uncomfortable, why do that procedure? Why not just scrap it, go to something else? Why did he have to do invasive vaginal insertion procedures on teenage girls? It doesn't even make sense if you think about it logically.
I think Judge Aquilina said it. He's sick in the head. That's, just sick in the head. That's all there is to it. Sick, a sick person. He goes to Eaton County next week. Will you be following it? You keep following this?
Yeah. Well, we're going to stay on this story. I mean, it's one of those things when you've gotten into it to this point from where I started, I feel I have an obligation, not just to the victims, but especially them, but to the public to see this through to the end. And as you stated earlier, this news cycle is changing daily, if not hourly. I mean, it was a reason why I was a couple minutes late here. These things are popping up. So we're going to stay on it. The Eaton County portion you're very well aware of. And this is just kind of halftime because the civil litigation, the Attorney General's investigation, the NCAA investigation, all three of these things are going on simultaneously for Michigan State, and it absolutely bears watching.
Did I see a congressional investigation or just before you came in?
Yes, Democrat Senator Gary Peters has called for congressional hearings. He wants to hold Michigan State University accountable. His counterpart, Senator Debbie Stabenow, had stepped forward, I think within the last 24 hours, calling for the resignation of Luana K. Simon. And that was the final part to this. Luana K. Simon wanted to claim that this had been politicized. Well, if it had been politicized, you would think there'd be maybe arguments on both sides of the aisle. This is one case with the government shutdown and President Trump and everything that's divided right now. Everybody in Michigan came together. Gretchen Whitmer, Debbie Stabenow, Gary Peters on the Democrat side, House Speaker Tom Leonard on the Republican side, Senator O'Brien on the Republican side. It doesn't matter. This issue doesn't know party lines. So for President Simon,
like supporting the survivors.
Well, it's supporting the survivors, but it's also, I think, holding people accountable from a legal standpoint. So when you see Senator Peters and you see that level of involvement congressionally, you see the bill being proposed by Senator Dianne Feinstein from California to help protect young women from ever going through something like this again. House Speaker Paul Ryan, again, Republican versus Democrat there, right? This legislation, I think, is going to be fast-tracked. I would keep a close eye on this, and I believe it will be passed into law within the next few months.
Yeah, it seems like we're definitely going to be seeing some changes on how things are handled and protect women and children more, for certain. Well, Ryan, I want to thank you for coming out and sharing your thoughts on this. I want to thank you for all the coverage that you've done.
Thank you.
And all the retweets from other reporters. I now am following so many more people. And if there's any survivors out there listening to this, thank you for your story. I know it's not hard. A lot of women have stories, and it's very difficult to share, and so it's very appreciative. And so just thank you for coming out today, and I look forward to following this and having the media out there covering it. It's very important.
I appreciate your time, and for all these heroes out there, I mean, this is for them. All of these women, they're incredible, and I don't know that I would have had the constitution to go through what they endured.
Very difficult. Thank you, Ryan.